think that the crux of all of it is that you just have to be agile and respond to it, right?
Yeah.
Like whether that means, okay, cool, like, budgets are drying up and people are being fussier about their spending, and that means that we need to like, refactor our discounting or refactor our, our approval workflows or whatever. I think that.
All right, everybody. Welcome back to the RevAmp podcast. I am your host, Mark Lerner. I'm joined here today by Pete Kazanjy. Super excited to hear about Pete's story and Pete's insights. So before we get started, Pete, why don't you tell the folks at home a little bit about yourself and your background and what you're doing?
Sure. Hey, folks, my name is Pete Kazanjy. I'm one of the founders of Atrium. Atrium makes sales performance management software that helps sales organizations improve rep attainment and performance through better management, better frontline management, which largely revolves around better data-driven management. Of course, we now use large language model AI to facilitate that, but the whole idea is to help managers better synthesize and act on coaching opportunities, accountability opportunities, encouragement opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I do. And then before Atrium, I started and sold a recruiting software company called TalentBin. Started in 2009, sold in 2014 to Monster Worldwide, and that's really where I went from being like what I call a business generalist founder, to being a first seller, sales manager, sales leader at TalentBin. And that's kind of like my background before that. I was in product management and product marketing. And so that's kind of how I got on the sales train, if you will. Ended up writing a book on startup sales subsequent to that called Founding Sales, which is kind of like the Bible of early stage selling, kind of like $0 to a couple $1 million of ARR. And then when I started, working on Atrium and doing the research associated with that, I started the nation's largest sales operations and leadership community called Modern Sales Pro. So think a little bit about modern, analytically excellent, operationally excellent sales. That's kind of my thing,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a lot of people that are going to be listening and watching this are probably very familiar with Modern Sales Pros. Probably are members of the community, and
MSP.
yeah, and I'm a big fan as well. I'm a member. I love seeing Google Groups being used to its optimal performance. Um, I think that's actually a good way to kind of kick things off. In your estimation, kind of from your viewpoint, what is modern sales? Is that kind of a moving target, and how is it different from what sales was before?
Yeah, I mean, the way I kind of think about this is, and I think this kind of goes to, but I have a copy of Founding Sales right here. Like, I think the thing that people oftentimes get confused as to, especially people who aren't in sales, like probably the people who are listening to this are in sales or sales operations or what have you. But ultimately, what sales is about is it's about like facilitating market transactions. It's like essentially it's like the grease that facilitates like how market economies work. And so the way that works is like you have a bunch of people who are like running around looking for demand, right? Either like looking for demand that knows it's demand, right? The people who know that they have a problem, or alternatively, looking for people who have the problem that like don't know that they have the problem, right? And like that's all we're doing, right? That's all we're doing is we're just like running around. And by the way, like that's actually how innovation gets spread throughout. The old joke about um, make a better mousetrap, the world will be the path to your door. No, it's not at all, right? Like it turns out that there's not a lot of people out there like, you know what, this mousetrap, it's
Right.
just really inferior. It's like, no, man, like we need to go to market in order to facilitate that. And so then the question then is like, okay, and that's like how new technology distributes, right? Like that's how market economies work. entrepreneurship happens. So then you would say, okay, cool. If that's like what sales does, then like what's the modern version of that? Well, doing it more effectively. And so I think a lot of the times we're kind of like sales as a bad word or whatever, like old school sales kind of gets a bad rap, is because doing that behavior of like finding demand in the market and then connecting with it, either to like elucidate to the demand that it has this problem, or finding that demand and being like, hey, I have the solution to your problem. That used to be a lot harder before we had like, prospect databases or the internet or CRMs or what have you, right? And so that's where sometimes you got like bad sales behavior that people kind of like stereotype associated with sales, like, all right, we got to always be closing, right? Like, okay, we're just going to close this deal whether or not they have pain or not, we're going to make it happen. Like the joke I like to say is, um, the old thing saying like, man, that guy's such a great sales rep. He can sell ice to Eskimos. It's just
Right.
like, dude, if you're selling ice to an Eskimo, like you're kind of an ass, right? Unless like the Eskimo happens to be in like Southern California and it's like, missing out on their like nostalgic for ice or whatever. And so I think what modern sales does is it's more about helping to facilitate that go to market in a more in a more fluid and a more operationally excellent and a more reduced customer acquisition cost
Yeah.
version. And so like that's technologies, that's messaging, et cetera, et cetera. And that's like what we all do as like, sellers or modern salespeople. And especially like that's what revenue operations is responsible for, is like adopting new technologies that helps facilitate that, adopting and deploying new technologies that facilitates that go to market in a more agile, in a more less frictionful capacity. That's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. You know, we've kind of connected over the years a bunch of times, but I got to see you in person recently at an event for Modern Sales Pros here in New York. And there were some super interesting conversations from, the viewpoint of sales leadership, some of the challenges there. Um, and I thought it was really fascinating, some of the challenges that exist, especially having been compounded by this kind of, we have whiplash from going from in office to at home to should we go back to in office to, there's a kind of a glut of good sellers. Then the market for, the employment market is really tight. And then now it's kind of shifting back. There's like so much going on. And there were some really super interesting stuff going on. But I mean, from your perspective, there's been there's a lot of back and forth right now. A lot of, it's hard to really even know where you're at. Um, from a leadership perspective and from leading a sales team, leading a sales organization and kind of sitting on top of that, um, how did that look, especially kind of when COVID hit and everyone has to work from home and the challenges around that? And now that we kind of are moving into some other new phase, what are the kind of the challenges there and some of
Yeah.
the learnings that you've had along the way?
Well, I think that the big thing there is, and I think before we kind of started the show here, you and I were kind of talking about the concept of agility and reacting to change and what have you. And I think there has been a lot of change, and I think the important thing that we have to do as as sales leaders and revenue operations people is be mindful of the change, but then also be mindful of like, there's this terminology that I like that, it's called Lindy, right? The term Lindy essentially means like old, right? Like it's been around for a long time,
Got it.
right? Like dancing is Lindy, right? Like dancing has been around for like millions of years, right? And like it started out as like meeting rituals or whatever, but um, and I think that like the important thing to think about is like what, like when things change or look like there's a change happening, is it like momentary, or is it something that like is just like a new way of doing something that's like very old, right? So like I'll give you a good example. It's like Zoom is a very powerful tool for having face-to-face interaction and synchronous communication with a prospect, right? The
Mhm.
reason why is because like face-to-face communication with a prospect, as compared to, asynchronous email or what have you, makes for very rich communication. Now we had that with the phone, right? But then I couldn't see your face, and you couldn't see my face, and you couldn't see my hand motions and things like that. And all of those things that we're describing right there are really important for getting a point across, for me reading you, for essentially just information exchange, which is kind of the crux of selling, right? Um, and so like, Zoom's a great example of like, okay, here's this new technology that potentially could get adopted in the face of big change, like, oh goodness, there's this like pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. But then I think the other thing to think about is like, yes, Zoom is far superior to, actually, I'm gonna date myself. Ready,
Okay.
guys? This is how old I am. I used to use ClearSlide a
I've
decade ago.
never even heard of it.
Oh, okay. So ClearSlide was like, 1.0 Zoom slash like high spot slash seismic, where like you could present slides, right? It would have like, the prospect would come to your branded URL,
Hmm.
right? Your meeting room. There wasn't any video though. And so it was a little bit better than, just being on the phone, which obviously was like a pretty sweet advancement. Um, but but when Zoom came around, all of a sudden now like I could see Mark's face and he could see me and so on and so forth, versus just like talking to like a black box, right? Um, so that's cool, and that was really great. But then potentially mistaking like, oh, okay, well, this is really good for customers, right? And it's better than calling on the phone. You know what? This is the same as sitting next to one of my colleagues next to me. Yeah, that's actually not true,
Right.
right? Like so, and so I think it's important to be mindful of, when using technology to reduce friction in certain situations, like, hey, now, and like, Salesforce is a phenomenal example of this. One might argue that Salesforce's biggest innovation was figuring out how to sell SaaS software to the mid-market over the phone,
Right.
right? So Salesforce had a primarily an inside sales motion when they started out, because there was this cloud delivered CRM that, like, unlike Siebel, right, that had to be on-prem, et cetera, et cetera. And because now you have like, sellers who are going and visiting these folks and helping on planes, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, like, I think the important thing there is to think about, like, when things change, is it's like, is this change facilitating something that is like long term important and useful, or is this change actually kind of like getting in between things? And another good example, so the conversation that we were having, Mark, or the event that we were at, was all around performance management, right? So we had a bunch of CROs, a bunch of VPs of sales operations talking about facilitating cultures of performance. And I think over the last like 5 years, that's actually been very difficult for a lot of organizations to do, because as you were kind of noting, um, COVID happened, a bunch of capital came into the markets, that then, got pumped into a lot of technology companies, by investors or VCs or what have you, who then turned around and were like, all right, we're going to hire ourselves some AEs. We're going to hire a bajillion of them,
Right.
right? And so, and moreover, we're going to hire a bajillion of them, and then everyone else is trying to hire a bajillion AEs. So that means they're going after our account executives as well. So, maybe we're going to like reduce, um, like performance requirements here. We don't want to like we're kind of maybe a little loath to have performance conversations, hold people more accountable, because they might just like bounce over to this organization over here that's like whispering sweet nothings in their ear, et cetera, et cetera. But if you think about it, like, ultimately all that's like momentary, right? Like, sales has been hard for a long time, and the reason why sales is hard is because there's scarce purchasing resources that are being sought after by sellers, right? This is why win rates are not like 80% or like 50% or whatever. Win rates are usually like 20%, 15%, or what have you. And so the notion that like selling was, could be easy, right? Or that quota is not hard to achieve, or that, sales is not a calorically intensive sport
Hmm.
based on how many customer facing meetings you're having or what have you. That's certainly momentary, right? And like the notion of sales like being hard and being full of rejection and being high level of effort is something that's been around for a long time. It's not going to change. And so that kind of goes back to, so like the notion of being hands off from a performance standpoint or performance management standpoint, that was like a momentary glitch in the matrix, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah, but and I think so. I think from this vantage point, it's pretty clear. It does seem that there were some people that drank the Kool-Aid and thought that, well, this is just the way things are, right? And they just, like you said, it was just, built bazillions of people, and then there's been a huge pullback, and this is kind of a side point, but you see, I think we in tech see these headlines about massive job growth, and then we look at our LinkedIn feeds and see all the people that we know that are looking for jobs and all the challenges around that. And it's like, it's hard to square these two things, but I think, there's probably a clear correlation between the kind of low interest rate and the investment environment for tech. And when you pull that back, investment dries up, budgets get lower, and then things kind of get more challenging.
Yeah, but I think that the crux of all of it is that you just have to be agile and respond to it, right?
Yeah.
Like whether that means, okay, cool, like budgets are drying up and people are being fussier about their spending, and that means that we need to like refactor our discounting or refactor our our approval workflows or whatever, right? And you want to be able to like agilely do that, like in your CPQ as an example, right? Like something that you guys focus on. Or alternatively, this is something that we see all the time with our customers where, um, performance managing. So like, sales performance, high performance comes from a high quantity of high quality sales effort, right? Okay, and then you can use metrics to then instrument those two things. You can instrument quantity of like effort. So like meetings and email volume and like new opportunity inflow and like stage advancements to stage 3 or pipeline advancement to this amount. And then there's quality, right, which is like conversion rates, like win rate, pipe hygiene stuff, untouched opportunities. And so in general what you want to do is like you want to measure and measure, manage, and improve the thing that's most important right now, right, to an agility standpoint. So like maybe 18 months ago, one of the big things that we would hear from our customers when like everyone was hiring a bunch of reps and people were spending a bunch of money on marketing and so on and so forth, it was like, hey, we want to instrument the ramp of these reps to make sure that they're ramping appropriately from a precursor standpoint. Oh, also these guys have so many opportunities in their pipe from inbound, right, that they're we really want to keep an eye on our untouched opportunity and our stuck ops, our pipe hygiene metrics, right? Cool. So like that was something that was a very common point of view 18 months ago or whatever, right? Like paying attention to those specific things. And then things shift and now it's like, oh, okay, cool. We let go half of our SDR team. And so now the account executives are expected to like, prospect 50% of their pipe. That now means we want to measure account executive prospecting activity and then account executive prospecting like outputs, like self-sourced opportunities, self-sourced pipe, et cetera, et cetera. But the whole point is like you want to be able to be agile about those things for whatever the thing happens to be.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's got to be tough from, the standpoint of leading people through that kind of change and saying, okay,
Sure.
yeah, I think that's kind of the mark of leadership is being able to, herald people through those changes and kind of acknowledge that, yes, it's difficult, but, this is kind of the new reality and this is actually sort of the way it was before. And that, the red herring was really kind of the last 2 years, but in the scheme of things, this is kind of normal. I think
Yeah.
people around my age, or maybe slightly younger, came up in a time where it was the years of plenty, and they
Mm-hmm.
don't remember 2008 or 2001 or all these things. So it's like I think part of it is keeping things in context of historically.
Yeah. I mean, this is what we were talking about at that executive dinner, right? Where we were talking about the role of the leader as like one component of the leader is, or one component of the leader's role is is teaching, right?
Yeah.
And so if you have, and this has only been compounded in a remote environment, which I'm not a fan of, but for a lot of reasons, but primarily one of like information transmission. I think
Mhm.
information. So like there was a CRO at that dinner, and she was talking about how she came up through EMC, right? Which is just like a vaunted sales organization, and so she knows what sales is like because or what sales ought to be like and is because she came up in an EMC sales environment with like 100 people on a sales floor. People are like locked in, eating lunch at their desk. Right? And the managers and like the person to your right is making a bunch of calls, the person to your left is making a bunch of calls, and in between that, they're on customer meetings and so on and so forth. And you're like, okay, cool, like this is how it's supposed to be, right? And then moreover, from a management standpoint, you see the managers kind of like cruising around like honeybees, right? Like checking in on reps, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, cool. That's how management is like. And the manager comes over and like talks to Bobby, who's like maybe kind of spaced out, like goofing off on his phone or whatever. And so it's like, okay, cool. Like this is, so what you have is you have like, learning by osmosis in an environment like that. So then two things happen. One is when you have people who are in a remote environment, you really can't rely on that osmosis, right? You have, right? And then secondarily, if you have like, if the market changes, where even if you had that environment, right, that in-person environment, but it's like, oh man, all these like inbound leads are showing up here, and like all these one call closes, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you might also be teaching the wrong message. And so this is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. If I when I was younger, I would probably just get mad about it. I'd be like, what's going on here? Like, why are these people like not understanding that like sales is hard and this is like a contact sport? But now I'm kind of like okay, cool. People need to be educated about this, right? And so like one thing I've been doing on like nights and weekends, I've been putting together this like big deck on what high performance and startup sales organizations look like, or mainly just startups. Um, Kind of because I think like the notion of like as an example, I grew up playing a lot of sports. Doesn't look like it now. That's me. but but um, but like coaching. One of your jobs as an employee is to be good at taking coaching, right?
Yeah.
And like that's what a manager is supposed to do. They're not so like yes, they are they are here to encourage you and lift you up when when things are problematic or whatever, but they're also here to sample your work, and when your work is lacking,
Mhm.
right, their job is to redirect that. That's literally their job, right? And so I think that there is um you know uh, a kind of a misapprehension or misconception in like white collar work for whatever reason, that that's kind of like, hey, you know what, we hire smart people and we let them do their thing, right? It's like the worst management advice of all time. um, or like we support them or whatever. It's like, no, actually what you do is you show them exactly how they're supposed to be doing the thing. You show them exactly how they're supposed to be doing a discovery call, how they're supposed to be, like down to very specific things, like this is how you set the agenda, this is how you open the call, right? Oh, right. And then you authenticate it and then you practice it, and then when and then when it's off, it's okay, you correct it nicely, right? But and I think that the notion of that behavior, like, hey, actually this is what management is supposed to look like, and this is like what you as a seller, this is like what this bargain looks like, is something that maybe has fallen off some in the like last 5 to 10 years. And so that's fine. We just have to re-educate as to what that looks like, right? And I think this it was like a very emotional conversation at the at the dinner, because I think there was a lot of like frustration around like like I never wanted to let it get this way.
Mm.
Like the leaders are thinking this, but it's like, but what could I do, right? Like if the entire world is like crazy, right? Then like what can I do, right? Do I like toe the line and like, no, 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 we're gonna keep being the way that we've always been? I think maybe and I think to your point about leadership, I think actually you could do that, right? You just like what you're what you're going to do is you're going to filter down to people who are really, really, really aligned with that message and that narrative, which might be a smaller set of folks than you might want. So you might impinge your growth, if you will, but at least you will keep your culture kind of like pure, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah, I think yeah, that was a lot of that. I was hearing a lot of that and
Oh yeah.
very much empathized with it because it was something I've observed, kind of from a distance across a lot of different companies that I've interacted with. And it's like, I kind of straddle two different generations. I think they call us geriatric millennials is what I'm called, So I'm kind of I can see there's a certain tension generationally, and I kind of can be on one foot or the other. Um, but I tend to, I think, empathize with the need for this concept. And here, I'll do a hot take and then get your perspective on it. There's this whole concept of the company being family, right? And then there's the other extreme, and I think we actually talked about it at the dinner as well. The other extreme would be the Netflix model, where it's not a family, it's a sports team.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
I always felt a little uncomfortable with the family concept. I think that maybe the sports team concept is a little too, you know, um, lacking empathy for the individual, but I
Sure.
never felt quite comfortable with the model of family company. So where's the happy medium there in terms of like what you think about?
I think, how about this? Like, I think it actually, I am more on the sports team side of things, but but I think the way that I would think about that is that like uh so Kim Malone Scott wrote this book called Radical Candor, right? And the kind of like the 2x2 matrix around so Radical Candor is all about like effective managerial communication, right? And like kind of the synopsis of it, it's like, hey, it's not mean, it's clear, right? And I forget what the 2x2 is exactly, but like one of it is like care deeply versus like don't really give a hoot about the person. And then there's um, like be direct or be indirect, right?
Yeah,
And so what you want is you want to be direct, but care deeply, right?
yeah,
Um, and so I think that the oftentimes where kind of like the Netflix kind of culture deck kind of gets maybe tripped up a little bit. People are like, "Oh, cool! Like we want to be really direct, and because this is a pro sports team or whatever, we don't actually have to care deeply." Um, I don't think that's true, and I actually don't think that there's any loss associated with like caring deeply, right? Like I'll give you an example. um, we recently had to let go some staff because our business changed. So Atrium um, really, really, really slaps when you get like 50, 100, 200 sellers. And the reason why, excuse me, is because um, when you get to around 50 sellers, that's when you have like 6 or 7 sales managers. And it gets to the point where now, as a CRO or as a VP of sales ops, you now need to actually enforce consistency on how your managers manage. Whereas, like, if you have like 3 sales managers, like 2 or 3 or 4 sales managers, maybe you can like let them get away with what I call like artisanal management. And but like when you get to 8 managers or like 10 managers, it's like, no way, man. Like, okay, cool. Like this is what our operating rhythm is going to be. This is what our one-on-ones look like. This is what our pipeline reviews look like. Like these are the goals that we're going to set for our team. Like here's the quotas, but also here's the pipe coverage goals. Like on the mid-market team, we're supposed to have this many customer-facing meetings per month, within this band, right? You're supposed to have under this number of untouched ops, you're supposed to have this amount of new opportunities to come in your pipe, blah, 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 right? And so this was something that we realized in the last 18 months was that that's where people get really excited about Atrium is when you get to that 8, like 6, 7, 8, 9. I mean, we have organizations we work with like 100 managers or whatever, but like that's where the pain goes from being that 7 or 8 is like where the pain goes from like, yeah, this is annoying to like, oh my god, this is awful, right? And so this is something that was new for us in the last 18 months. So we actually have a bunch of um, existing customers from the go-go, like zero interest rate period, that have like, two managers or one manager. And some of those organizations, like they just love Atrium, and like they'll go other places and they'll come and buy us again. Um, but but like it's not really a net new focus for us, right? And so we had some staff who were more focused on those littler accounts, right? And it just turned out that we didn't really have that, like we weren't going to be acquiring any of those going forward. So it was one of those things where it's like, hey, you're great, you've done a great job on these things right here that used to be something that we needed, but something changed, right? Something changed. And so like we don't need this, like this role doesn't exist anymore, and we wish we had another role for you, but we don't really have another role for you given your skill profile or whatever. So what we're going to do is we're going to let you go, and we're going to do it in a way that like provides severance, and we're going to help you. We're going to provide full-throated recommendations and so on and so forth and like we're going to like go through Indeed and LinkedIn and find potential roles that we have contacts with. So so like that's a good example of like being eyes wide open and like business centric, but doing it in a way that is like appropriate. Now the way that it would not be appropriate would be like, hey, we don't have this role anymore, but we're going to pretend that this person can do this new role that they can't do, because that would be awful. Like
Yeah.
now they're just like setting payroll expense on fire. They're pissing off their colleagues, right? Like you're shortening your runway to no end. And I think that that's an important, like oftentimes what I like to do is like simplify things for my staff, because I think a lot of times staff, again, need to be educated on how like businesses and startups work. Is like, I just equate it to like a hot dog stand or like a restaurant. It's just like, hey, look, like it turned out that previously we sold this like type of dish over here that it turns out that there wasn't demand for in the market anymore, right? So we don't need this person who, like, it would be silly to have someone continuing to make, I don't know, baby hot dogs, right? When all of a sudden people don't, or like corn dogs. People don't like corn dogs anymore, right? They only want hot dogs. And so to pretend that we should have this person sitting here making corn dogs when they're just like stacking up in the corner here over there, like that's not useful for anybody else in the organization, and it's like destructive of resources. So what we need to do is we need to part ways in an amicable and supportive way, but like we can't pretend.
Right. Yeah. And I think, as we kind of round things out here, one thing that, becomes clear to me is that the agility, the requirement for being agile is not purely laid at the feet of leadership. I think we as individual contributors, as sales leaders, frontline salespeople, have to be agile and kind of understand that, it's not the end of the world, but things change, situations change, and you just got to kind of roll with the punches. And I think if everyone kind of had that mentality, things would probably be a little bit smoother.
I mean, I think that's what makes marketing, like market economy, so effective, right? If you have a rep who really wants to be a manager and they're ready to do it, and there's not a managerial role within your organization, then like sure as all get out, they should they should go look somewhere else to do that, right? And because in this case, it's like this person has a need that is not being serviced within this organization. The converse of that is like this organization doesn't have a need anymore that would be serviced by this person. In both situations, having that person who's ready to be a manager sit around in the organization kind of like hoping and waiting or whatever is probably not a good use of their human capital, right? And that's why like the American economy is like so dynamic and produces so much value and richness for everyone, is because we can move these resources around, like move these resources around in a very effective way, and B, motivate the high performance of these resources because they desire to make more money, right? Like they desire to be more effective, because then value will accrue to them. And so all these things, like that agility of like moving resources out or bringing resources in, or and also managing the performance of your resources, that's like good. Right?
Yeah.
That's the thing that like in stark contrast to like less dynamic economies where okay, cool, like the resources can kind of like twiddle their thumbs or what have you, right? Or alternative, like we're going to keep these resources on even though it's not something that like the business needs. And conversely, like you can imagine the cascade of that. We're going to keep this manager over here in this other organization who's kind of like yucky, right? Even though, man, what we would do is we would kick him out and then hire this manager, like this rep over here from this other organization to come over here. If you have that stasis, right, that gridlock like across an economy, then like everyone's bummed.
Yeah. I think the proof is in the pudding. If you look at the kind of the growth as people exit, the challenges are kind of soft landing. If you look at the way different economies have handled it, our economy compared to ones that have a little less,
Dynamism.
yes, it's clear. That's a definitely a conversation for another day, one that I find fascinating. But Pete, thank you so much for your time today. This was really, really interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
As we end things up here, why don't you tell the folks at home some places they can learn more from you, read your content, where they can follow you, things like that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if like sales for like high performance sales management is a topic that you folks are interested in, you find me on LinkedIn. I post a lot there. Same on Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, like that's all we focus on here at Atrium is high performance sales management, driving performance on sales teams. So if that's something that's like up your alley, check us out.
All right. Thank you so much, Pete.